The flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a knife through black water, illuminating nothing but the skeletal branches of pines and the swirling mist that clung to the mountainside like a living thing. The woman holding the light moved with purpose, her boots finding purchase on the loose scree, with the practiced ease of someone who understood terrain the way most people understood their own living rooms. Her breath came out in short white bursts, each one stolen by the wind before it could fully form. Walt. Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something she was holding down with both hands. Walt, can you hear me? The mountain answered with silence. Not the peaceful silence of a quiet evening, but the aggressive swallowing silence of a place that had no interest in giving back what it had taken. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine resin and the metallic tang of approaching rain. Somewhere far below, a creek whispered over stones, indifferent to the drama playing out above it. She stopped, tilted her head, closed her eyes. She was listening for something specific. Not a shout, not a cry, something smaller, something most people would dismiss as the wind or a trick of the mind. The wrong sound. The tiny rattle in a vast, indifferent engine that told you everything was about to come apart. And then she heard it. Faint, barely there. A thin, tuneless humming rising from the ravine below like smoke from a dying fire. Her eyes snapped open. Cut to black. 14 hours earlier. The garage smelled the way it always smelled: motor oil solvent, the warm ghost of exhaust, and the faintest undertone of old leather. It was the kind of scent that had seeped into the concrete floor over years and would outlast the building itself. Morning light came through the single high window in a narrow beam, catching the dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny planets orbiting nothing. Reese Calloway stood at her workbench with her hands inside the open chest of a 2004 Harley Softail, her fingers moving with the unconscious precision of a surgeon. She didn't need to look at what she was doing. Her hands knew the geography of this engine, the way a blind man knows his own home, every bolt and gasket and worn rubber seal mapped in muscle memory, built over 2 decades of work. She was 42 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low knot, practical rather than styled. Her forearms were lean and corded, the kind of strength that came not from a gym, but from years of torquing stubborn bolts and lifting cylinder heads. There was a thin scar across the back of her left hand where a timing chain had bitten her 11 years ago. She'd finished the job before she'd gone to get it stitched. The garage was her kingdom, a single-bay operation on the outskirts of Ridgemont, Colorado, a town of 4,000 that sat in the shadow of the Blackwood Range like a dog sleeping at its master's feet. The walls were hung with tools organized by size and function, each one in its designated place, each one clean, despite the nature of the work. A pegboard above the bench held wrenches arranged in descending order, their chrome faces catching the light like a row of small mirrors. On the shelf beside the window sat a portable radio, tuned to a classic rock station, playing low enough to be felt rather than heard, and next to it, a small framed photograph. The photograph showed 2 people standing on a mountain trail, a woman in her early 30s, dark hair loose around her shoulders, laughing at something off camera. Beside her, a young man, maybe 19, with the same jawline and the same dark eyes, his arm thrown around her shoulder, with the easy confidence of someone who believed the world was fundamentally a safe and generous place. The light in the photo was golden late afternoon, and behind them the Blackwood Peaks rose into a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Reese did not look at the photograph. She hadn't really looked at it in years. It sat on the shelf the way a headstone sits in a cemetery, marking something that used to be alive. She finished the Softail's oil change, wiped her hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades, and stepped back to examine her work. Satisfied, she lowered the bike off the lift and rolled it toward the open bay door. The morning air hit her face, cool and dry, carrying the faint sweetness of pine from the mountains above. Saturday, her day. The ritual was always the same. She checked the tires by feel, running her palm across the tread, the way a horseman runs a hand down a leg, feeling for heat, irregularity, anything that whispered of trouble. She checked the chain tension, the brake fluid level, the mirrors. She pulled on her leather jacket, zipped it to the sternum, and settled her helmet over her head. The world narrowed to the view through the visor, and for a moment everything was simple. The engine caught on the first kick, a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the frame and into her bones. She eased out of the garage, down the gravel drive, and onto the 2-lane blacktop that led north out of Ridgemont toward the mountains. She didn't wave to the neighbors. The neighbors had learned over the 8 years she'd lived here that Reese Calloway was not unfriendly, but was deeply fundamentally private. She paid her bills on time, kept her property clean, and once fixed the Hendersons' lawnmower without being asked and without accepting payment. But she did not attend block parties. She did not make small talk at the mailbox. She existed in the town the way a stone exists in a river, present and solid, but allowing everything to flow around her without resistance. The road climbed, the town fell away. The houses thinned and then vanished, replaced by stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that pressed in close on both sides, their trunks, straight and dark like the columns of a cathedral built by something older than any church. The air thinned and cooled. Reese leaned into the first curve, feeling the bike respond beneath her like a living thing, and the noise in her head, the low, persistent hum of memory and regret that was her constant companion, began to fade. This was why she rode. Not for the speed, not for the image, for the silence it created inside her. The route was always the same, north on County Road 7 past the Blackwood Creek Bridge, where the water ran clear and fast over smooth stones. West on the mountain highway, climbing through switchbacks that tightened as the elevation increased. Past the old logging turnoff, past the fire lookout tower that hadn't been staffed in 20 years, past the rusted sign for the Blackwood Creek trailhead that marked the beginning of a network of hiking paths popular with tourists and day trippers. And then at the top, Ridgeline Overlook. It was nothing special, not really. A small pullout on the mountain road, a low stone wall built by the Civilian Conservation Corps sometime in the 1930s, and a view that stretched for 60 miles on a clear day. To the south, the valley floor spread out in a patchwork of fields and small towns. To the north, the mountains continued their ancient march toward the Continental Divide, peak after peak, fading into blue haze. And directly below, dropping away with dizzying steepness, the North Canyon, a deep V-shaped gash in the mountainside choked with old-growth timber and threaded by a creek that caught the sunlight in occasional silver flashes. Reese had been stopping here every Saturday for 8 years. It was her midpoint, her church if she had one. She would park the bike, swing her leg over, and stand at the stone wall for exactly as long as it took the engine to stop ticking as it cooled. Then she would get back on and ride home. No photographs, no picnic lunch, just the view, the silence, and the slow return of the noise she'd come to quiet. Today was no different. She pulled into the overlook at 12:30, killed the engine, and dismounted. The air was thin and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles warming in the midday sun, and underneath it the faint mineral smell of distant rain building over the western peaks. A few white clouds drifted across the sky with the lazy indifference of things that had nowhere to be. She was alone, which was the point, until she wasn't. He was standing at the stone wall, and at first she didn't register him as unusual. People stopped at the overlook all the time, hikers and tourists, and the occasional photographer chasing the light. But something about this man made her look twice, then a third time, and then she couldn't look away. He was old, not just elderly, but old in the way that mountains are old, weathered down to something essential and hard. 75 at least, probably closer to 80. He had the frame of a man who had once been powerfully built, broad shoulders that now carried a slight forward curve, hands that were large-knuckled and mapped with veins like the roots of an old tree. His hair was white-cropped, close to the skull, in a style that spoke of decades of military discipline, and his posture, despite the curve, retained a ghost of ramrod straightness, as if his spine remembered standing at attention even if his muscles had forgotten. He wore a red flannel shirt, faded but clean, tucked into khaki trousers. On his feet were hiking boots. Good ones, expensive. The leather broken in but well-maintained, laced tight and double-knotted, with the care of someone who had been taught that equipment keeps you alive. But he wasn't hiking. That was the first thing that was wrong, though Reese wouldn't articulate it until later. He had no pack, no water bottle, no walking poles, no hat against the sun, no trail map folded into a cargo pocket. He was dressed for the mountain but equipped for nothing. Like someone had put the costume on him but forgotten the props. And he was standing absolutely still. Not the stillness of someone admiring a view. Not the stillness of someone resting. The stillness of a man who had stopped in the middle of a sentence he'd been speaking to himself and lost the thread completely. The stillness of a machine whose power has been cut without warning. He wasn't looking at the valley. He wasn't looking at the peaks. He was staring down into the North Canyon, not at it, but into it the way you stare into a fire or into deep water, seeing something that isn't visible to anyone else. Reese gave a short nod, the universal acknowledgement between strangers in a shared space. Most people up here returned it with a smile, a comment about the weather, maybe a question about the trails. The old man turned his head slowly and his eyes found hers. They were pale blue, the color of ice on a winter creek, and they held a quality that stopped Reese's breath in her chest. They were sharp, intelligent, and absolutely terrifyingly lost. Not confused the way a person is confused when they take a wrong turn. Lost the way a radio signal is lost when the transmitter goes dark. The eyes of a man who had been somewhere a moment ago and was now nowhere at all. I don't know where I am. 5 words, delivered without panic, without quaver, without the slightest tremor of distress. A statement of fact. A reading from an instrument that had no reason to lie. The voice was quiet, measured the voice of a man who had given orders and expected them to be followed. And the calm in it was worse than any scream, because it meant he had already accepted the verdict of his own confusion. The sound of it went through Reese like a cold wire. She had heard wrong sounds her entire adult life. The faint tick in a valve train that meant a lifter was dying. The almost inaudible whisper of air escaping a hairline crack in a manifold. The subtle change in pitch that told you a bearing was 300 miles from catastrophic failure. She had built her livelihood on hearing what other people missed, and every cell in her body was telling her now that the sound coming from this man's mouth was wrong in a way that mattered. She opened her mouth to respond, to ask if he needed help, to ask his name, to ask where he'd come from. But before she could form the words, a vehicle pulled into the overlook behind her. A silver SUV, clean late model with tinted windows that reflected the mountains back at themselves. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-50s, tan slacks, pressed polo shirt the color of money leather, belt leather shoes that had no business on a mountain road. His hair was styled, not just cut, and his face wore an expression of practiced concern that Reese recognized instinctively. She'd seen that face on service managers who were about to tell you your warranty didn't cover the thing that had just broken. "There you are, Walt." The man's voice was warm, smooth, calibrated to reassure. He walked to the old man and placed a hand on his arm, gentle but firm, the way you guide a shopping cart that's drifted into the wrong aisle. "Gave us a scare, buddy. Let's get you back to the car." The old man, Walt, let himself be turned away from the wall. The strange intensity drained from his posture. He seemed to deflate, to become smaller, as if whatever signal had been keeping him locked on the canyon had been switched off. He went with the man in the polo shirt without resistance, without complaint, like a dog that has learned that pulling against the leash only makes things worse. The man glanced at Reese as he guided Walt toward the SUV. He gave her a smile, the kind of smile that is designed to close a conversation before it opens. "He wanders," the man said. "Early stages. We're managing it." The words were smooth, polished like stones that had been tumbled in a machine until all their edges were gone. They were the kind of words that expected no follow-up questions and would brook no further inquiry. They were, Reese thought later, the words of a man who had said them many times before. She watched as the man helped Walt into the passenger seat, fastened his seatbelt for him, and closed the door. Through the tinted glass, she could see the old man's profile, still and rigid, staring forward at nothing. The man walked around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he looked at Reese one more time. The smile was still there, but behind it, in the fraction of a second before he turned away, she caught something else. A flicker. A calculation. The look of a man checking to see if he'd been observed doing something he shouldn't have been doing. Then the door closed. The SUV pulled out gravel crunching under its tires and turned north on the mountain road, away from the trailhead, away from town, climbing higher into the mountains. Reese stood at the overlook and watched until the silver flash of the SUV disappeared around the next switchback. The engine of her Harley ticked in the cooling air. A hawk circled far below, riding a thermal that rose from the canyon floor. She should have gotten back on her bike. She should have finished her ride, gone home, cleaned her tools, eaten dinner, gone to bed. That was the pattern. That was the ritual. That was the armor she had built around her life to keep the world and its demands at a distance. Instead, she stood there replaying the encounter in her mind, the way she replayed the behavior of a malfunctioning engine, running the sequence back and forth, listening for the wrong note. The boots. They were good boots, expensive, broken in over years of actual use, not the stiff, pristine boots of someone who bought them for a single trip. Someone had laced them tight, double-knotted them with care. But the man's hands were clean. Not just free of dirt from today's outing, clean in the way that hands are clean when they haven't touched anything rougher than a bedsheet in weeks. No grime under the nails, no calluses from gripping walking poles, no redness from cold or wind. Someone had dressed him for the mountain, put the right boots on his feet, the flannel on his back, the costume of a man out for a hike. But they hadn't given him a water bottle. They hadn't given him a pack or a hat or a phone or any of the things a person actually carries when they intend to spend time on a mountain. They had dressed the part but skipped the purpose. And the man in the polo shirt, the speed of his arrival was wrong. Reese had been at the Overlook for no more than 3 minutes before the silver SUV appeared. Ridgeline Overlook was 7 miles from the nearest trailhead, 12 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding mountain road that took at least 20 minutes to drive from either direction. The man hadn't been searching. He hadn't been frantic. He hadn't been driving slowly, scanning the roadside the way you drive when you've lost someone. He had pulled in with the calm efficiency of a man arriving at an appointment. He knew where Walt would be. Reese shook her head. She was doing it again, reading too much into too little, finding the wrong sound in an engine that was running fine. The man was a caretaker. Walt had dementia. He wandered. The caretaker found him. End of story. She put her helmet on, kicked the Softail to life, pulled out of the Overlook and headed south back toward town, back toward the comfortable insulated silence of her garage and her tools and her Saturday evening routine. She passed the Blackwood Creek trailhead 3 miles down the mountain. The parking lot was half full with the cars of hikers and families enjoying the October afternoon. She did not see a silver SUV among them. She noted this without knowing why she noted it, the way a mechanic notes a sound without consciously deciding to listen for it. The silver SUV had turned north at the Overlook away from the trailhead, climbing higher. Not toward any campground or picnic area that Reese knew of. Toward the old service roads, the decommissioned logging cuts that wound through the high country like the dried-up veins of something that had stopped pumping decades ago. She filed this away in the part of her mind that collected wrong sounds and rode on. The afternoon passed. The light shifted from the hard white of midday to the warm amber of a Colorado autumn evening, the kind of light that turned the aspens to fire and made the mountains look like they'd been dipped in honey. Reese pulled into her driveway at 4:45, parked the bike in the garage, and began her evening routine with the methodical precision that governed every aspect of her life. She wiped down the chrome with a soft cloth, following the same pattern she always followed: handlebars first, then tank, then pipes. The motion was meditative, almost hypnotic, her hands moving in slow circles while her mind drifted in the pleasant nowhere of a task that required effort, but not thought. The small television on the dusty shelf was tuned to the local news volume, low more for the company of human voices than for any interest in what they were saying. The anchor was talking about a high school football game, then the weather, then a pause, the kind of pause that precedes a shift in tone, the broadcast equivalent of a doctor sitting down before delivering results. We're getting reports of a missing person in the Blackwood Creek area. Reese's hands slowed on the chrome but didn't stop. 78-year-old Walter Brogan was reported missing this afternoon by his legal guardian. Brogan, a retired Army veteran, was last seen at the Blackwood Creek trailhead at approximately 1 p.m. He is described as 6 feet tall, 170 pounds with white hair. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and khaki trousers. The rag stopped moving. Reese turned to face the television. The anchor had been replaced by a reporter standing in the fading light of the trailhead parking lot. Behind her, the organized chaos of an active search was taking shape. Flashing lights from sheriff's vehicles, uniformed figures moving with purpose, the bright vests of volunteers beginning to gather. The camera cut to a photograph. Not a school picture, but a portrait, the kind taken at a VA hospital or a senior center against a plain blue background. The face in the photograph was clean-shaven, the white hair neatly combed, and the pale blue eyes looked directly into the camera with an expression that was alert, dignified, and unmistakable. It was the man from the Overlook, Walt. Brogan suffers from early-stage vascular dementia, the reporter continued. His guardian Mitchell Price reported that Brogan wandered away from a rest area near the trailhead while the two were on an afternoon outing. The camera cut to a man standing in front of the flashing lights, his face arranged in an expression of anguished concern. Polo shirt, tan slacks. The man from the silver SUV. I only turned away for a minute, Price said, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine distress. He was sitting on the bench, and then he was just gone. Walt doesn't always know where he is. He gets confused. Please, if anyone has seen him. Reese's rag dropped to the concrete floor. She looked at the clock on the wall. 6:47, nearly 6 hours since she'd seen Walt at the Overlook. The sun had already sunk below the western ridge, and she knew with the certainty of someone who had spent half her life on these mountains exactly how fast the temperature was falling. 40 degrees an hour once the sun dropped below the peaks. By midnight, it would be in the low 20s. By dawn, the teens. An old man in a flannel shirt, no jacket, no pack, no water. But it wasn't the cold that made her hands go numb. It was the math. Price said Walt wandered away from the trailhead rest area at approximately 1 p.m., but Reese had seen Walt at Ridgeline Overlook at 12:30, and she had watched Price load Walt into the silver SUV and drive north away from the trailhead at 12:33. She hadn't checked her watch, but she knew the time because she always arrived at the Overlook at the same time. Her ritual was precise. 12:30, give or take 2 minutes. She'd been there long enough to park, dismount, see Walt, hear him speak, and watch Price arrive. 3 minutes, maybe 4, 12:33, 12:34. So at 12:30, Walt was not at the Blackwood Creek trailhead. He was at Ridgeline over 7 miles north and 2,000 feet higher. And at 12:33, Price was not searching for a wandering old man. He was collecting one calmly and efficiently and driving him further into the mountains. For Walt to have wandered away from the trailhead at 1 p.m., Price would have had to drive him back down from the Overlook, a 20-minute trip, at least park at the trailhead, and then somehow lose him again. Possible. But if that's what happened, why didn't Price mention the Overlook? Why didn't he tell the search team that Walt had already wandered once that day, that he'd been found 7 miles north of the trailhead less than an hour earlier? That information would have been critical. It would have told the searchers that Walt was mobile-oriented toward the north, capable of covering significant distance on foot. Unless Price didn't want them looking north. Reese picked up the rag from the floor, folded it carefully, and set it on the workbench. Her hands were moving with the slow deliberation that her hands always showed when something in her mind was running very fast. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and dialed the number displayed on the television screen. The hotline answered on the second ring. A calm, professional voice. Female. Young. Trained to manage the emotions of worried callers. Reese spoke carefully, keeping her voice flat and factual, the voice she used when explaining to a customer what was wrong with their engine and what it would cost to fix. She told the dispatcher that she had seen Walt Brogan at Ridgeline Overlook, 7 miles north of the trailhead, at approximately 12:30 that afternoon. She told her that Walt had been alone at the stone wall staring into the North Canyon. She told her that a man matching the description of Mitchell Price had arrived in a silver SUV and driven Walt away to the north, not the south. Thank you, ma'am, the dispatcher said. We'll add your information to the log. All available units are currently searching the Blackwood Creek trail area and surrounding. He wasn't at Blackwood Creek, Reese said. He was 7 miles north, and his guardian drove him north, not south. Your search grid is in the wrong place. A pause. The dispatcher's tone shifted by 1 degree from professional warmth to professional patience, the tone used for well-meaning callers who have watched too much television. Ma'am, we appreciate your call. Our teams are following established protocols based on the last confirmed sighting. Your information has been noted and will be reviewed by the search coordinator. The last confirmed sighting is confirmed by the man who lost him, Reese said. I'm telling you, I saw something different. Your information has been noted. Thank you for calling. The line went dead. Reese stared at the phone in her hand, noted, logged, filed in the digital equivalent of a drawer that nobody would open until the search was over one way or another. She was just another caller with a tip that didn't fit the established narrative. The official account, the version of events provided by the concerned guardian, who was even now standing in front of cameras with tears in his eyes. She set the phone down on the workbench next to the folded rag. She looked at the television where the reporter was wrapping up the segment with the standard appeal for information. She looked at the clock, 6:52. The temperature on the mountain would be dropping through the 30s, now heading for the 20s. She looked at the photograph on the shelf, Danny, laughing on a mountain trail, his arm around her shoulder, 20 years old, and certain that the world was a place where nothing truly terrible could happen, because someone would always be there to catch you. He had called her on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She'd been underneath a Sportster with a stuck exhaust bolt, and she'd let the call go to voicemail. She'd meant to call back. She always meant to call back. But the bolt was stubborn, and the next job was waiting, and the afternoon got away from her the way afternoons do when you're not paying attention to the things that matter. Danny went hiking alone the next morning. He took a trail he didn't know well enough in weather that was changing faster than the forecast had predicted. He slipped on wet rock above a steep drainage. The fall was 40 feet. The rescuers found him the following day, but by then the mountain had already taken what it wanted, and all that was left was the cold mathematics of time and gravity in a phone call that was never returned. 12 years. 12 years of Saturdays on the mountain, 12 years of the ritual ride that was simultaneously an act of penance and a refusal to be afraid of the place that had taken her brother. 12 years of listening to engines and hearing the wrong sound in everything except the one moment when it mattered. She had not listened when Danny called. She would not make that mistake again. She pulled her jacket back on. The leather settled over her shoulders with a weight that felt different, this time heavier, denser, as if the jacket understood the difference between a Saturday ride and what she was about to do. She zipped it to the throat, grabbed her helmet, grabbed her keys. The garage door rolled up, and the evening air poured in cold and sharp with the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. The Harley's engine split the quiet of the suburban evening, not the easy rolling rumble of a leisure ride, but something harder, something with an edge. The sound of a machine being asked to do work that mattered. Reese Calloway rode north into the darkness toward the mountain that had taken her brother, and was now, she was certain, in the process of taking someone else. The Blackwood Creek trailhead was 4 miles off the main highway at the end of a winding Forest Service road that climbed through dense timber before opening into a gravel parking area large enough for maybe 50 cars. Tonight it held twice that many plus a dozen emergency vehicles whose lights painted the surrounding trees in alternating washes of red and blue, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the forest look like it was breathing. The scene was organized chaos, heavy on the chaos. Portable floodlights powered by humming generators bleached the color from the night, turning everything within their reach into a harsh, flat white that made the darkness beyond their perimeter seem even more absolute. Volunteers in orange and yellow vests milled around a folding table where coffee was being poured from industrial thermoses. A pair of German shepherds sat at their handlers' feet, panting, waiting to be told where to go. Radios crackled with the staccato shorthand of people who were too busy to use complete sentences. Reese parked her bike at the far edge of the lot, away from the lights and the noise, and stood for a moment, taking it in. She was aware of how she looked: black, leather jacket, riding boots, helmet under one arm, the Harley ticking behind her. She was not a hiker. She was not a volunteer in an orange vest. She was not a concerned neighbor, or a church group member, or any of the categories that the people running this search would recognize and know how to process. She was an outsider, and she knew from a lifetime of experience that outsiders carrying information they believe is important are the last people anyone wants to see at an organized emergency response. She scanned the command post, a cluster of folding tables arranged beneath a pop-up canopy, their surfaces covered with topographical maps held down by coffee mugs and flashlights, and the elbows of people leaning over them. She was looking for a specific kind of person, not the one barking orders, not the one talking on the phone. The one whose eyes weren't moving, whose gaze was fixed on the map with the steady, focused intensity of someone carrying the full weight of the operation on their shoulders, someone who had stopped seeing the chaos around them because all their processing power was directed at the single problem that mattered. She found her at the center table. Sergeant Maren Voss was a woman who looked like she had been carved from the same stone as the mountain she worked in. Mid-40s, sharp-featured with dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail so tight it seemed to pull her entire face into a state of permanent concentrated alertness. She wore a jacket with ISAR Command stenciled across the back in reflective letters, and she was leaning over a topographical map with both hands planted on the table, her index finger resting on a specific contour line while she spoke in a low-clipped tone to a deputy standing beside her. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had not slept enough and would not sleep for a long time, and had made her peace with that fact. They were also the eyes of someone who had lost a search before and carried the weight of that failure in a place that no amount of professional training could reach. Reese approached. She waited for a break in the conversation that never came. Finally, she stepped forward. "Excuse me." Marin looked up, and her gaze hit Reese like a physical thing, a wall of exhaustion and authority, and the barely contained frustration of a person who was running out of time and options. "If you're here to volunteer, sign in at the check-in table." She turned back to the map. "I called earlier." Reese kept her voice level. "I'm the one who saw Walt Brogan at Ridgeline Overlook this afternoon, with his guardian at 12:30. Marin turned back. Her eyes narrowed, taking in the leather jacket, the riding boots, the helmet tucked under Reese's arm. The biker. The outlier. The data point that didn't fit the grid. Ridgeline Overlook. Marin's voice was flat, neither dismissive nor encouraging. "We got the note from dispatch. It's outside our primary search area. Scent dogs lost the trail half a mile up the main Blackwood Creek loop. We're concentrated there." "Your dogs are on the wrong trail," Reese said. A flicker of something crossed Marin's face. Not anger, not yet. Annoyance, the controlled kind that professional people deploy when civilians tell them how to do their job. "We follow evidence. We follow scent. We follow probability grids built on the last confirmed sighting." "The last confirmed sighting was confirmed by the man who lost him," Reese said. "And he's lying." That got Marin's full attention. She straightened up from the table, her hands still planted on the map, and looked at Reese with an expression that was no longer dismissive, but was not yet open. It was the expression of a woman whose training told her one thing, and whose instincts buried deep under years of protocol and procedure were telling her something else. "That's a hell of an accusation." "It's not an accusation," Reese said. "It's a discrepancy. Price told you Walt was at the trailhead rest area at 1 o'clock. I saw Walt at Ridgeline Overlook at the 12:30, and I watched Price drive him away in a silver SUV heading north. Not south, not toward this trailhead, north toward the old service roads." She leaned forward and placed her finger on the map 7 miles north of where Marin's finger had been. Here. He was standing right here, and he wasn't looking at the valley. He was staring straight down into the North Canyon toward the old logging cut. Marin looked at the map, then at Reese, then back at the map. Outside the tent, radios crackled and generators hummed, and the search continued in its methodical, procedural, and potentially futile pattern. "Who are you?" Marin asked. "My name is Reese Calloway. I'm a mechanic." "A mechanic." "My job is listening for the sound that's wrong, the tiny rattle in an engine that tells you something is about to fail. That man's voice this afternoon, the way he said what he said, and where his guardian claims he was versus where I actually saw him. It's the wrong sound, Sergeant. And every minute your team spends searching down here is a minute that man is alone up there in the cold." Marin Voss stared at Reese Calloway for a long time. Every fiber of her training said to dismiss this woman. Civilians were emotional. They saw patterns where there were none. They mistook coincidence for conspiracy and gut feelings for evidence. Marin's job was to deal in facts. Last known position. Scent trails, probability grids built on data, not on the instincts of a motorcycle mechanic who had stopped at an overlook and seen an old man looking at a canyon. But the search was stalling. The dogs had lost the scent at the creek crossing and hadn't recovered it. The main trail had been swept twice with nothing to show for it. The temperature was dropping, and with every degree it fell, the probability curve shifted in a direction that Marin did not want to think about. The math was brutal and simple. A 78-year-old man with dementia, improperly dressed for the conditions, had been missing for nearly 7 hours. The survival window was closing, and it was closing fast. And there was something in this woman. In her quiet, stubborn certainty, in the way she pointed at the map without hesitation, without the theatrical urgency that civilians brought to these situations. She wasn't frantic. She wasn't emotional. She was reporting a discrepancy with the flat factual precision of someone who was used to diagnosing problems that other people couldn't see. Marin chewed on her lip. She looked at the map one more time. Then she made a decision that would either save a man's life or end her career. "All right, mechanic," she said. "You're coming with me." She turned to the deputy beside her, a tall man with a weathered face and the careful posture of someone who had spent 20 years trying to be the right kind of authority figure in a small town. Tanner, get me a two-person team, Yates and his dog. We're taking a vehicle to Ridgeline Overlook. She paused, then keyed her radio. Dispatch, this is Voss. Detaching a small unit to check a secondary location. Low probability, maintaining primary grid operations under Lieutenant Hargrove. She fixed Reese with a look that carried the weight of every search she'd ever run, every decision that had turned out right, and every one that hadn't. Every minute we spend on your wrong sound is a minute we're not on the main grid. You understand that? I understand it, Reese said. If this is nothing, if we drive up there and find an empty overlook in a dark canyon and not a single piece of evidence that backs up your story, you and I are going to have a very short conversation, and then you're going to get on your motorcycle and ride home and never set foot at one of my search sites again. And if it's not nothing, Marin didn't answer. She was already moving. The ride to the overlook was made in a white SAR truck with oversized tires and a light bar on the roof that Marin left dark. Reese sat in the back seat beside a young man in his late 20s who had the lean, tightly wound energy of a distance runner and the skeptical expression of someone who had been pulled from his assigned grid to chase a civilian's theory. His name was Corbett Yates. He was a K9 handler in the Belgian Malinois sitting between his knees, a compact, muscular animal with alert amber eyes and ears that swiveled independently like radar dishes was called Titan. Corbett stroked the dog's head in a slow, rhythmic motion that seemed to calm them both. He hadn't spoken a word since getting into the truck. He didn't need to. His body language said everything. He trusted his dog, he trusted his sergeant, and he did not trust the woman in the leather jacket who had convinced both of them to leave the search area. The fourth member of the team was a searcher named Weeks, a quiet, bearded man in his 40s who carried a coil of climbing rope over one shoulder and a medical pack on his back, and who radiated the competent calm of someone who had done this enough times to know that the outcome was never certain, no matter how well you prepared. Nobody spoke during the drive. The truck climbed the mountain road in darkness, its headlights carving a tunnel through the black wall of forest on either side. The road was empty. No other vehicles, no hikers, no signs of human presence. Just the trees and the road and the stars above the canopy, cold and indifferent and very far away. Reese watched the mile markers pass and tried not to think about time. 7 hours now at minimum. The temperature gauge on the truck's dashboard read 34 degrees and falling. At elevation at the overlook, it would be lower. Low 30s heading for the 20s. Wind chill would push it further. A man in a flannel shirt, no jacket, no shelter, no way to call for help. The human body could survive a remarkable amount of punishment, but it could not survive the simple, relentless mathematics of heat loss. Core temperature drops 1 degree per hour in these conditions. Below 95 degrees, the shivering stops. Below 90, the organs begin to slow. Below 85, the heart gives out. The window between alive and not alive was measured not in hours but in the single degrees of a thermometer that nobody was holding. The overlook appeared in the headlights like a stage set waiting for actors. The low stone wall, the gravel pullout, the wooden sign marking the viewpoint. In daylight, it was a place of warmth and openness and the kind of panoramic beauty that made people reach for their phones. At night, in the harsh white glare of the truck's lights, it was something else entirely. The stone wall was a dark line against a darker void, and beyond it the canyon dropped away into nothing, a blackness so complete and so deep that it seemed to have substance, as if the darkness itself were a liquid that had filled the valley to its rim. The wind was sharper here, colder, with an edge that cut through jackets and gloves and found the skin beneath. It carried the smell of pine and cold stone and something else, something faintly metallic, the smell of a mountain at night when the temperature is dropping fast enough to squeeze the moisture from the air and leave it dry and thin and hard. Marin parked the truck with its headlights aimed at the stone wall and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the wind was the only sound, a low, constant moan that rose and fell like breathing. Reese stepped out and walked to the wall. She stood exactly where she had stood that afternoon, and she pointed into the darkness. He was here, facing this direction, not looking at the valley, looking down into the North Canyon toward the old logging road. And he wasn't scanning. He was fixed on one spot like he could see something down there. Marin aimed a high-powered flashlight into the canyon. The beam was impressive, a solid column of white light that should have reached 100 yards. It reached maybe 30 before the undergrowth swallowed it. Dense rhododendron mountain laurel tangles of fallen timber, choked with moss and deadfall. Below the brush line, the terrain drops steeply, not quite vertical, but close, a rock-strewn slope that would be treacherous in daylight and suicidal in the dark. "There's no trail there," Corbett said, stating what everyone could see. "There is," Reese said. "It's just been a long time since anyone used it. Old logging cut, comes in from the north about a quarter-mile down the slope, follows the drainage to the creek." Corbett looked at Marin. Marin looked at the map she'd spread across the truck's hood, using the headlights to read the contour lines. The logging road was there, a faint dotted line on the topographical survey decommissioned so long ago that it had likely been reclaimed by the forest. It ran roughly north-south through the bottom of the canyon, crossing the creek at a point marked on the map but invisible from above. "If he went down there," Marin said, "he went down without a trail. 78 years old, bad legs, confused. In broad daylight, maybe. Maybe he could have picked his way down, using the brush for handholds. But he would have fallen. Somewhere on that slope, he would have lost his footing." She looked at the canyon as if she could see through the darkness by force of will alone. "All right, fan out along the ridgeline. Standard call and response. Yates, see if Titan can pick up anything. Anything at all. Weak, stay on rope standby. Nobody goes over the edge without my say-so." The search began. They spread out along the rim of the overlook, spacing themselves at 20-yard intervals, each one carrying a flashlight that seemed absurdly small against the scale of the darkness they were trying to penetrate. The protocol was simple and ancient. Call the name. Wait, listen. Call again. Move 20 yards. Repeat. Walt. The name went out into the night and died. Not an echo, not a return, just the sound being absorbed by the forest and the wind and the vast, indifferent mass of the mountain. It was like shouting into a pillow. The trees took the sound and held it and gave nothing back. "Walt Brogan, search and rescue, can you hear us?" Silence, wind, the distant, almost subliminal sound of water moving over rocks somewhere far below. They moved along the ridgeline, calling at intervals, their flashlight beams cutting frantic, isolated paths through the undergrowth below the wall. Each beam found the same thing. Branches, rock shadow. More branches, more rock, more shadow. No flash of red flannel. No movement. No sound except the ones they were making themselves. Corbett worked Titan along the wall, letting the dog lead with his nose. The Malinois moved in quick, zigzagging patterns, his body low, his ears forward, sampling the air, with the intense concentration of an animal doing the thing it was born to do. But after 10 minutes, Corbett pulled up and shook his head. "Too much wind," he said. "It's pushing everything down into the canyon. If there's scent, it's below us, and Titan can't reach it from up here." Marin nodded. She hadn't expected the dog to work miracles, not in these conditions, but she had hoped. Hope was the currency of search and rescue, spent freely in the early hours and hoarded like gold as the night wore on. An hour passed. They covered the entire accessible ridgeline in both directions, calling, listening, scanning with flashlights that grew progressively less effective as the batteries burned down. The wind picked up, driving the temperature lower, making their fingers clumsy and their faces numb. The stars overhead were brilliant cold, the pitiless stars of high altitude that seemed to look down on human endeavor with faint amusement. A second hour passed. Marin's radio crackled periodically with updates from the main search at the trailhead. Lieutenant Hargrove's teams had expanded the grid south and east, following Price's suggestion about the old mill pond. They had found nothing. The scent dogs at the trailhead were circling confused, unable to establish a consistent trail. The entire search, both the main effort and Marin's splinter team, was running into walls. Reese stood at the stone wall and stared into the darkness. She could feel the skepticism radiating from Corbett, like heat from an engine block. She could feel Weeks' quiet professional patience beginning to thin. She could feel Marin's resolve wavering, the internal calculation that every search commander makes when the evidence says one thing and the clock says another. She was wrong. The thought circled her mind like a vulture, patient and persistent. She was wrong about the boots, wrong about the timeline, wrong about the direction. Walt had wandered off from the trailhead exactly as Price said. He was somewhere in the Blackwood Creek drainage 3 miles south, and every minute these 4 people and 1 dog spent up here on the ridgeline was a minute subtracted from the old man's shrinking odds of survival. She thought about Danny. about the phone call she hadn't answered, about all the times in her life she had dismissed the small nagging signal that something was wrong, rationalizing it away, filing it under the comfortable heading of not my problem or probably nothing. Then Marin's radio crackled again, and the voice on the other end was not a search team leader giving an update. It was dispatch, and the tone was different, harder. Voss, this is command. Be advised, Sheriff Kendrick is assuming coordination of all search operations effective immediately. All non-essential personnel are to return to the Trailhead Command Post for reassignment. Repeat, all non-essential personnel to Trailhead. Acknowledge. Marin looked at the radio in her hand as if it had bitten her. Sheriff Kendrick, the name carried weight in this county, the kind of weight that had nothing to do with law enforcement competence and everything to do with political connections, campaign donations, and a network of mutual obligations that stretched from the courthouse to the church pews to the boardrooms of every business that mattered in a 50-mile radius. She keyed the mic. Command Voss, clarify non-essential. All personnel not directly assigned to the primary search grid. That includes any civilians attached to your unit. Reese and Marin locked eyes. The message was clear. It wasn't about search efficiency. It was about removing the one person who had contradicted Mitchell Price's account of where Walt Brogan had last been seen. Before Marin could respond, headlights appeared on the mountain road below them, climbing toward the overlook. A sheriff's cruiser pulled into the pullout, its light bar dark, its engine idling with the low authoritative rumble of a vehicle that expected to be obeyed. Deputy Boyd Tanner stepped out. He was a tall man, late 30s, with the kind of face that was built for straightforward decency, but was currently arranged in an expression of acute discomfort. He wore his uniform like it fit well, but didn't feel right tonight. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, but near it, a gesture of habit rather than threat. Marin. His voice carried the specific weight of a man delivering an order he didn't write and didn't agree with. I need you to bring your team back to base. Sheriff's orders. Marin didn't move from the truck's hood where she'd been leaning over the map. On what grounds? Search coordination is being centralized. All splinter teams recalled. And He glanced at Reese and something flickered across his face that might have been apology. Any civilian attachments need to be cleared from the search area. Liability concerns. Liability. Marin repeated the word, coming out flat and cold. That's what I was told. Boyd, we're working a viable secondary location based on a credible eyewitness account that contradicts the Guardian's timeline. Pulling us out now. I know. Tanner's voice dropped, and for a moment the uniform fell away, and he was just a man standing on a dark mountain, trying to do the right thing inside a system that was making it very difficult. I know, Marin, but the order came from Kendrick directly, and Kendrick got a call from someone. I don't know who. I don't want to know who. I'm just the messenger. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Reese had ever heard. It was the silence of a system closing ranks of institutional power being deployed not to find a missing man, but to protect the person responsible for losing him. She had heard this silence before in different contexts in the waiting rooms of mechanics who had been told their honest assessments were bad for business, in the phone calls from insurance adjusters who found it more convenient to deny a claim than investigate it. It was the silence that descended when the truth became inconvenient for the people who controlled the narrative. Marin straightened up from the map. She looked at Tanner, then at Reese, then at the dark canyon below the wall. The wind blew her ponytail across her face and she pushed it back with a sharp, impatient gesture. Then she reached for her radio, held it up so Tanner could see it clearly, and switched it off. I appear to be experiencing equipment failure, she said. Her voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm, and as hard as the stone wall behind her. My radio has malfunctioned. I'll return to base as soon as it's operational. Tanner stared at her. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked at the dead radio in her hand, then at her face, and something passed between them. A silent negotiation conducted entirely in the language of people who had worked together long enough to understand each other's limits. Equipment failure, he said. That's correct. Another silence. Tanner looked at his boots. He looked at the cruiser. He looked at the dark forest pressing in from every side. Then he walked back to his car, got in, closed the door, and sat there. He did not start the engine. He did not radio in. He simply sat in the cruiser with the lights off and the engine idling, a man who had chosen to be present at something without being responsible for it. It was a small act. the kind of act that would never make a report or a headline or a commendation. But Reese understood it, and from the look on Marin's face, she understood it too. Boyd Tanner had been given an order, and he had delivered it, and now he was going to sit in his car and not notice what happened next. Marin turned to her team. "We continue. Corbett, take Titan down the slope as far as you can safely go without ropes. Weeks, anchor point at the wall, be ready to deploy if we find anything." Calloway. She looked at Reese, and for the first time there was something in her eyes that was neither suspicion nor tolerance, but something closer to partnership. "Show me exactly where he was standing." "Exactly." Reese went to the wall and placed her hands on the stone cold and gritty beneath her palms. She oriented herself by memory, by the feel of the wall under her fingers, in the angle of the canyon below. She had stood here 1,000 times. She knew this view the way she knew the layout of her workbench, every angle, every shadow, every feature mapped in the deep architecture of repetition. "Here," she said. "He was standing right here. His hands were on the wall just like this. And he wasn't looking out. He was looking down. Not at the general canyon, at a specific point." She angled her body, adjusting until the memory clicked into place like a socket wrench, finding the right bolt. There, about 30 degrees left of center, where the ridgeline drops away behind those rhododendrons. Marin aimed her flashlight where Reese was pointing. The beam hit the thick, dark mass of rhododendron bushes that crowded the edge of the drop-off, their waxy leaves reflecting the light in hard, flat plains that revealed nothing of what lay behind them. "That's not a line of approach," Corbett said. "That's a dead end. Solid brush, then a cliff." "It's not a cliff," Reese said. "It's steep, very steep. But if you push through those bushes, you'd find a slope, rocky, loose, maybe 30, 35 degrees. Bad footing, but not vertical. A man could go down it. He'd fall. He'd slide. But he could go down it." "How do you know that?" Marin asked. "Because I've been looking at this canyon every Saturday for 8 years. The drainage line runs from that point down to the old logging road about 150 feet below. When the snow melts in spring, you can see the water channel from right here. It's the natural path of least resistance down the north face." Marin studied the map again, tracing the contour lines with her finger. The terrain confirmed what Reese was describing, a steep but not vertical slope running from the overlook down to the old logging road, following a natural drainage channel that would be invisible under the summer and fall vegetation, but would provide a passable, if dangerous, route for someone determined or confused enough to attempt it. Corbett took Titan to the edge of the brush line and let the dog work. The Malinois pushed his nose into the base of the rhododendrons, sniffed with intense concentration, pulled back, circled, and pushed in again. Corbett watched his dog the way Reese watched an engine, reading the subtle signals that only came with years of partnership. "He's interested," Corbett said slowly. "It's not a clean hit. The winds have been blowing for hours, scrubbing everything. But he's interested in this spot." "Interested enough?" Marin asked. Corbett looked at his mate, then at the dark tangle of brush. "Interested enough that I wouldn't want to leave without checking?" They checked. The next 90 minutes were a grinding, punishing slog through some of the worst terrain Reese had ever encountered. The rhododendrons were thick as a wall, their branches interlocking like fingers laced together in prayer, and pushing through them required brute force and a willingness to accept that every inch of exposed skin would be scraped, scratched, and torn. Behind the brush line, the ground dropped away sharply, a slope of loose shale and decomposed granite studded with embedded boulders and threaded with the exposed roots of trees, clinging to the mountainside by what seemed like pure stubbornness. They moved in a line, Marin in front, with the strongest flashlight, Reese behind her, Corbett, with Titan on a short leash bringing up the rear. Weeks stayed at the tomb, anchored to the stone wall with a rope ready to deploy if anyone found anything, or if anyone needed to be hauled back up. Their progress was measured in feet, not yards. Each step required testing the ground, finding a stable surface, committing weight, and then doing it again. The loose rocks shifted and slid under their boots, small cascades of gravel rattling down the slope into the darkness below. Every few minutes they stopped and called. "Walt, search and rescue." The forest absorbed the sound. The wind carried it away. Titan whined and pulled at his leash, not tracking a clear scent, but responding to the generalized anxiety of his handler in the strangeness of the terrain. The dog wanted to help, but couldn't find the thread. At the halfway point, or what Reese estimated was the halfway point, Marin stopped and turned around. In the glow of her flashlight, her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and her expression held the specific combination of determination and doubt that Reese recognized from her own mirror on the mornings when she wasn't sure a repair was going to work, but wasn't ready to admit it. "We've covered 100 yards of slope," Marin said. "No visual, no scent, no response to calls. I have to make a decision soon, Calloway." Reese nodded. She understood the math. Every minute here was a minute not spent elsewhere. Every step down this slope was a step that had to be climbed back up. Marin was risking her career, her team's safety, and the time that might be needed to find Walt in a different location, all on the strength of a mechanic's gut feeling and a pair of clean hands on an old man who had said 5 words at a stone wall. "I know," Reese said, and she did know. She knew the weight of a decision made on insufficient evidence. She knew the specific nauseating gravity of betting someone else's life on your own judgment. She had lived with the consequences of getting it wrong for 12 years. They continued. Another 30 yards. Another 50. The slope steepened, and they had to use their hands grabbing roots and rock edges to keep from sliding. Titan scrambled beside Corbett, his claws scratching on stone, his body low and tense. The darkness below them was total, a black so complete that the flashlight beams seemed to stop at a wall rather than fading into distance. Marin's radio, still switched off, sat in her pocket like an accusation. Back at the trailhead, Sheriff Kendrick would be running the show now, organizing the search according to Price's account, sending teams south toward the mill pond that Reese was certain Walt had never visited. Every minute that Marin's team was unaccounted for was a minute that Kendrick would note, a minute that would appear in the after-action report, a minute that would need to be explained. At the bottom of the next pitch, where the slope leveled briefly onto a narrow shelf of relatively flat ground before dropping away again, Marin stopped. She braced herself against a boulder and looked back up the slope they'd descended, then down at the darkness below. "Calloway." "Yeah, I'm calling it. We go back up, rejoin the main search, and I file a report recommending a daylight team check this area at first light." The words hit Reese like a closed door. She understood them. She even on some level agreed with them. The rational part of her mind, the part that diagnosed engines and calculated repair costs, and managed the unforgiving economics of a one-woman shop, understood that Marin was making the correct decision based on the available evidence. You don't risk 4 lives and a dog on a hunch when the evidence doesn't support it. But the other part of her mind, the part that had spent 12 years listening to the echo of a phone call she hadn't answered, that part was screaming. 30 seconds, Reese said. Marin frowned. "What?" "Give me 30 seconds. Everyone stop moving. Stop talking. Turn off the lights. Turn off the 30 seconds, that's all I'm asking. Then we go." Marin stared at her. The request was irrational. It violated procedure which called for continuous visual and auditory monitoring during an active search. Turning off the lights on a steep, unstable slope in the middle of the night was the kind of thing that got people hurt or killed, or at minimum written up in an incident report with words like reckless and unauthorized. But Marin had turned off her radio 2 hours ago. She had driven 7 miles into the mountains on a mechanic's theory. She had pushed through a wall of rhododendron and descended 150 feet of treacherous slope in the dark. She was already so far past procedure that 30 seconds of silence was barely a footnote. 30 seconds, she said. Starting now. She killed her flashlight. Corbett killed his. Reese killed hers. The darkness closed in like a fist, so total and so immediate that Reese felt her balance shift, her inner ear, suddenly uncertain which way was up. She steadied herself against the boulder and closed her eyes because there was nothing to see, and because closing them sharpened the one sense she needed. She listened. The wind came first. It always came first, the constant shifting voice of the mountain, moving through the trees above them with a sound like distant surf. Behind the wind, the creek far below, now a thin silver thread of sound that came and went as the wind shifted. Behind the creek, the almost subliminal hum of the mountain itself, the deep geological bass note of rock and earth and gravity that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. She listened past all of it, past the wind, past the water, past the mountain. She was listening the way she listened to an engine, not for the sounds that were supposed to be there, but for the one sound that wasn't. The rattle, the tick, the whisper of air through a crack that shouldn't exist. The wrong sound that changed everything. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The darkness pressed against her closed eyelids. The cold pressed against her skin. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, and she breathed slowly, deliberately, pushing it down, making room for whatever the mountain was going to give her. 20 seconds. Corbett shifted his weight, and a small cascade of gravel rattled down the slope. Titan whined a thin, high sound of canine impatience. Marin's breathing was slow and controlled, the breathing of a woman who was counting down to 0. 25 seconds. And then she heard it. Not a cry, not a shout, not the sound that search and rescue teams are trained to listen for, the deliberate signal of a conscious person who knows they are being sought. This was something else, something smaller, something that rose from the darkness below them like a thread of smoke from a fire that was almost out. A hum, low, tuneless, barely more than a vibration in the air. The sound an old man makes when he has run out of words and run out of strength, and the only thing left is the melody of a song learned so long ago that it lives in the body rather than the mind. It rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing, hitching occasionally when the cold made the lungs clench, then resuming with the stubborn, unconscious persistence of a heartbeat. Reese's eyes opened. There, she pointed into the darkness, not down the slope they'd been descending, but slightly to the left toward a section of the canyon wall obscured by a thick curtain of rhododendron that overhung a gap in the rock face. Below those bushes, left of where we've been looking. I don't hear anything, Corbett said. Listen. They listened. The wind shifted, and for a moment the humming was clearer, close enough now that it had shape and texture. The ghost of a marching cadence, the kind of a song that gets into a soldier's bones during basic training and stays there for 60 years, outlasting memory, outlasting language, outlasting everything except the body's stubborn refusal to stop making sound. I hear it, Marin whispered. Flashlights back on, 3 beams converging on the rhododendron curtain. Marin moved first, pushing through the thick branches with the focused aggression of a woman who has found what she was looking for and will not be stopped by vegetation. The branches scraped and clawed at her jacket, her face, her hands. She didn't slow down. Behind the rhododendrons, the ground vanished. A drop-off, not sheer, but close, a near vertical face of crumbling rock and exposed root systems that fell away into a narrow ravine. Not a canyon within the canyon exactly, but a fold in the terrain, a crease in the mountain skin that was invisible from above and would have been easy to miss even in daylight. Marin aimed her flashlight down. 30 feet below, wedged into a notch between 2 boulders at the base of the drop-off, a patch of red flannel caught the light like a signal flare in the darkness. Walt, Marin's voice was sharp now, charged with a current that hadn't been there before. The professional calm was gone, replaced by something raw and urgent and very human. Walt Brogan, Search and Rescue, can you hear me? The humming stopped, a silence that lasted 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and then a voice rose from the ravine, thin and cracked and confused, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. I'm down here. The words were small. They were swallowed almost immediately by the wind and the darkness and the vast indifference of the mountain. But they reached the 4 people standing at the top of the drop-off with the force of a thunderclap, because they were the words that changed everything. The words that separated one kind of story from another. The words that meant the difference between a search and a recovery. He was alive. Marin was on her radio before the echo faded. The equipment failure miraculously resolved her voice, crisp and precise, and carrying the controlled urgency of someone who has done this before and knows that the next 30 minutes are the most important of the night. Command, this is Voss. We have located Walt Brogan at Ridgeline Overlook, North Canyon, approximately 150 feet below the stone wall on the north face. Subject is conscious and responsive. Requesting technical rescue team and medical evac to our position immediately. Subject has been exposed for approximately 8 hours in falling temperatures. Probable hypothermia, possible injury from fall. Repeat, subject is alive and conscious. Get me a rope team and a litter. Now. The radio exploded with voices, confirmations, questions. The sound of a search operation pivoting from despair to action in the space of a single transmission. Somewhere at the trailhead 7 miles south, generators would be roaring to life, and vehicles would be starting, and trained people with ropes and harnesses, and medical kits would be loading into trucks and heading north at speed. But that was minutes away, maybe more than minutes. The mountain road was narrow and winding, and a technical rescue team with equipment moved slower than a search party traveling light. Marin knew this. She calculated the time the way Reese calculated engine tolerances, with precision and without comfort. She turned to Weeks, who was already uncoiling his rope. "Weeks, you're going down. Assess his condition. Keep him warm. Keep him talking. Do not attempt to move him until the tech team arrives." Yates anchored the rope at that boulder. 2-point system, no exceptions. Weeks nodded. He shrugged out of his jacket, revealing a base layer that would give him more freedom of movement on the descent, and pulled on a pair of leather gloves. He clipped into the rope with the smooth, practiced motions of a man who had rappelled into worse places. Then this checked his connection twice and went over the edge without hesitation. The rope sang against the rock as he descended. His headlamp bobbed and swayed, a small, white star falling slowly into the darkness. Reese watched from the edge, her flashlight beam tracking his progress as he picked his way down the near-vertical face, finding footholds in the crumbling rock, using roots as handholds, moving with the careful, deliberate speed of someone who understood that a rescue becomes a double rescue very quickly if the rescuer gets hurt. Weeks called as he descended. "My name is Weeks. I'm search and rescue. I'm coming down to you. Just hold still, sir. We're going to get you out of here." The humming had resumed, softer now, more broken, but persistent. The old man was still making sounds, still pushing air through his lungs and shaping it into something that resembled melody. It was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing Reese had ever heard, because it meant he was alive and it meant he was fading, and both of those things were true at the same time. Weeks reached the bottom. His headlamp steadied as he found his footing on the floor of the narrow ravine and moved toward the red flannel shape wedged between the boulders. He knelt. His hands moved quickly, professionally, checking pulse, checking, breathing, checking the temperature of the skin on the old man's neck and wrists. Voss Weeks' voice echoed up the rock face. "Subject is conscious but disoriented. Severe hypothermia. Core temp is low, very low. Right leg is injured, probable fracture below the knee. He's been lying in the same position for hours. I need those blankets, and I need that litter, and I need them 5 minutes ago." Marin relayed the information over the radio, her voice tight with the specific frustration of a person who has found what they were looking for and is now fighting time to keep it. Reese stood at the edge and looked down. Weeks had positioned his body between Walt and the wind, creating a human windbreak. He had stripped off his own base layer and wrapped it around the old man's shoulders. He was talking to Walt in a low, steady voice, the kind of voice you use with a frightened animal or a waking child, a voice designed to anchor someone to the present moment, when the present moment is cold and painful and terrifying. Walt had stopped humming. In the glow of Weeks' headlamp, Reese could see the old man's face pale and drawn, the skin tight over the bones, the lips blue-gray with cold. His eyes were open but unfocused, drifting in and out of the here and now like a radio signal fading at the edge of range. And then his eyes found Reese. She was standing 30 feet above him, a dark silhouette against the stars, holding a flashlight that must have been blinding from his perspective. She was nobody to him, a stranger, a shape in the dark with a light. There was no reason for him to recognize her, no reason for his wandering attention to fix on her rather than on the man kneeling beside him or the one whining at the rim above. But his eyes locked onto hers and something shifted in them. The fog receded for a moment, the way clouds part to reveal a patch of blue sky before closing again, and in that moment of clarity, Walt Brogan looked at Reese Calloway with an expression that carried no confusion, no fear, no pain, just recognition. The simple, profound recognition of one human being seeing another and knowing with a certainty that transcended the failing architecture of his mind that this was the person who had come. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look was enough. It said everything that needed to be said. It said, "You heard me. You heard the wrong sound, and you came back." The technical rescue team arrived 23 minutes later, and eternity measured in degrees of body temperature. They came with ropes and pulleys and a Stokes basket and thermal blankets and IV bags that they kept warm inside their jackets against their own body heat. They were efficient and focused and very, very good at what they did. They stabilized Walt's leg with an inflatable splint, wrapped him in layers of insulation, secured him in the basket with practiced, gentle hands, and began the slow, grueling process of hauling him up the rock face. It took 4 of them pulling in unison, their boots digging into the loose scree, their muscles straining against the weight of a man in a metal basket and the relentless downward pull of gravity. The rope creaked. The pulley squealed. Small avalanches of rock cascaded down the face with each heave. Reese stood back out of the way, her flashlight aimed at the basket as it rose inch by inch, foot by foot out of the darkness that had held Walt Brogan for 8 hours. When the basket cleared the lip of the drop-off and was set on the relatively level ground behind the rhododendrons, the team moved with the choreographed urgency of people transitioning from rescue to evacuation. Paramedics who had hiked in with the tech team took over checking vitals, adjusting the thermal wrapping, starting an IV line with hands that were steady despite the cold. Reese knelt beside the basket. She didn't know why. She had no medical training, no authority, no role in what was happening. She was a mechanic. She fixed engines. She had no business being here on this dark mountain beside this broken old man in the middle of an operation run by people who had trained their entire careers for exactly this moment. But she knelt anyway, and Walt's eyes found hers again. His hand moved beneath the thermal blankets, slow and weak, searching for something. It found her wrist. His fingers were ice cold and had almost no grip, but they closed around her wrist with a pressure that was not about strength, but about intent. He was holding on to her the way a drowning man holds onto a rope, not because he can pull himself up, but because letting go means accepting that the current has won. His lips moved. The words came out in a whisper so thin that Reese had to lean close her ear inches from his mouth to hear them above the wind. He left me here. On purpose. He wants the land. 7 words. Delivered with the same flat factual calm as the 5 words he had spoken at the Overlook that afternoon. Not an accusation, not a plea, a diagnosis. The reading of an instrument that had no reason to lie, delivered by a man whose mind might be failing, but whose instinct for the truth was as sharp and clear as the stars overhead. Reese pulled back and looked at him. His eyes were already clouding again, the window of clarity closing, the fog rolling back in. But the words hung in the air between them, as real and solid as the stone wall above. She looked up and found Marin standing over them. The sergeant's face was unreadable in the harsh light of the headlamps, streaked with dirt and sweat, her ponytail half collapsed from the night's exertion. But her eyes were very still and very focused, and Reese knew that she had heard. The paramedics lifted the basket and began the carry-out, moving through the rhododendrons and up the slope with the careful, steady pace of people carrying something fragile and irreplaceable. Marin and Reese followed in silence, picking their way up the terrain they had descended hours earlier, using the rope that Weeks had anchored as a guideline. At the top, the Overlook was transformed. More vehicles had arrived, their lights turning the small pullout into a makeshift staging area. An ambulance was parked with its rear doors open, the interior glowing warm and gold, a rectangle of light and warmth and medical capability, waiting to receive what the mountain was reluctantly giving back. They loaded Walt into the ambulance. The doors closed. The vehicle pulled away, its lights painting the trees red and white as it descended the mountain road toward the hospital 30 miles below. Reese stood at the stone wall and watched the lights disappear around the first switchback. The wind had died down, and in the sudden stillness, the night felt different, lighter, as if the mountain had been holding its breath for 8 hours and had finally reluctantly exhaled. Marin came and stood beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. 2 women standing at a stone wall in the dark, looking out at nothing, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into their bones the way cold settles into stone. Then Marin spoke, and her voice was different than it had been all night. The command tone was gone. The professional distance was gone. What was left was quieter roar, the voice of a woman talking to the only other person in the world who understood what the last 6 hours had cost. "What did he say to you down there when you knelt beside him?" Reese looked at Marin. She thought about the words. She thought about what they meant, not just for Walt Brogan's rescue, but for everything that would come after. "He said Price left him here on purpose," Reese said. "He said Price wants his land." Marin was silent for a long time. Then she nodded once, a small, tight movement that carried the weight of his decision being made. "Then we're not done," she said. The hospital smelled the way all hospitals smell, a blend of antiseptic and recycled air, and the faint underlying sweetness of something that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that most people stopped hearing after a few minutes, but that Reese, with her mechanic's ear for the wrong sound, could not tune out. It was a steady, insistent 60-cycle drone that lived in the walls and the ceiling, tiles and the polished linoleum floors, and it made the silence between conversations feel electric, charged with something unresolved. She had followed the ambulance down the mountain on her Harley, riding through the darkness with the kind of focused attention that left no room for thought or doubt or the delayed trembling of adrenaline that she knew was coming. The ride took 40 minutes. The ambulance took 30, its lights clearing the road ahead, its sirens splitting the mountain quiet with a sound that scattered deer from the shoulders and sent raccoons scrambling into the underbrush. At the hospital, she had parked the bike in the visitor's lot and walked through the emergency entrance without any clear idea of what she intended to do. She was not family. She was not a first responder. She had no legal standing, no medical knowledge, no authority of any kind. She was a woman in a leather jacket with dirt on her hands and scratches on her face, standing in the bright, sterile corridor of a county hospital at 2 in the morning, waiting for news about a man she had met for the first time 12 hours ago. The nurses let her stay. Whether this was policy or pity, or simply the path of least resistance when confronted with a woman who clearly had no intention of leaving, Reese didn't know and didn't ask. She sat in a molded plastic chair in the hallway outside the treatment room and waited with the patience of someone who was accustomed to waiting for engines to cool and paint to dry and the slow, stubborn process of rust giving way to solvent. Marin arrived an hour later, still in her SAR jacket, still carrying the topographical map she had been studying when Reese first walked into the command tent a lifetime ago. She sat in the chair beside Reese without being invited and stretched her legs out in front of her, crossing them at the ankles. Her boots left faint tracks of mountain dirt on the clean floor. They sat in silence for a long time. The fluorescent lights hummed. A nurse walked past, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped with the steady rhythmic insistence of a metronome. His core temperature was 89 degrees when they brought him in, Marin said without turning her head. 3 more degrees and we'd be having a different conversation. The fracture is clean tibia below the knee. He fell about 15 feet before he hit those boulders. At his age, with his condition, that fall should have killed him. The doctors can't explain why it didn't. Reese said nothing. She was thinking about the humming, the old marching cadence that had risen from the ravine like smoke from a dying fire. She thought about what it took to lie broken and freezing in the dark for 8 hours and still find the breath to make music. She thought about what kind of man does that, what kind of training, what kind of stubbornness, what kind of fundamental refusal to let the silence win. You were right, Marin said. The words came out flat without emphasis, as if she were reporting a weather observation. About the location, about the timeline, about the sound. I was right about something else too, Reese said. Marin turned to look at her. He told me Price left him there on purpose. I heard. He said Price wants his land. I heard that too. Marin leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. A confused old man with dementia making an accusation against his legal guardian. You know what that's worth in a courtroom. About as much as a mechanic's hunch was worth at your command tent. Marin opened one eye and looked at Reese with an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. Fair point. They let Reese see him just before dawn. The doctors had stabilized his temperature, set his leg, and moved him to a private room on the second floor. He was propped up in bed with his right leg elevated in a cast and IV line running into the back of his hand and a thermal blanket pulled up to his chest. The machines beside him beeped and hummed and displayed numbers in green and red that Reese could not interpret, but that the nurses seemed to find acceptable. He looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had at the Overlook. The fluorescent light was unkind to his face, deepening the hollows under his cheekbones and turning his skin the color of old paper. But his eyes were open, and when Reese appeared in the doorway, they tracked to her with a steadiness that surprised her. She stepped into the room. She didn't know what to say. She had not rehearsed this, had not imagined. It had not planned beyond the simple, stubborn act of showing up. She was a mechanic. She fixed things that were broken. She did not know how to fix a 78-year-old man with a fractured leg and a failing mind, and a guardian who had tried to kill him by leaving him on a mountain. You're the one from the wall, Walt said. His voice was thin, raspy from cold and dehydration, but the words were clear. The fog that had clouded his eyes at the Overlook was there, hovering at the edges, but for now the signal was strong. Yes, sir, Reese said. Sit down. She sat in the chair beside his bed. The vinyl squeaked under her weight. Outside the window, the first gray light of dawn was seeping into the sky above the mountains, turning the peaks from black to dark blue to the faintest suggestion of gold along their eastern edges. Walt studied her face with the careful attention of a man who has learned not to trust his own perceptions and is therefore doubly careful with the ones that feel real. "I told you I didn't know where I was," he said. "You did." "I wasn't talking about the mountain." Reese waited. She had learned a long time ago from years of listening to customers describe the sounds their engines made that the most important information usually came in the silence after the first statement. People said what they thought they were supposed to say, and then if you waited, they said what they actually meant. Walt looked at the ceiling, his jaw worked, the muscles moving beneath the papery skin, and Reese could see him fighting the fog, pushing against the edges of his own diminishing clarity, the way a man pushes against a door that is slowly, inexorably closing. "My wife Eleanor, she died 6 years ago. We were married 49 years. After she went, things got—" He paused, searching for the word, and Reese could see the frustration in his eyes. The specific grinding frustration of a man who once commanded soldiers and balanced budgets and built a life with his own hands and now could not reliably locate the word he needed in the filing cabinet of his own mind. Confused. Things got confused. I started forgetting, not big things at first. Where I put my keys, what day it was. Then bigger things, names, faces, whether I'd eaten, whether I'd locked the door. He turned his head to look at Reese. "Price showed up about 4 years ago, said he was from an agency, said he could help manage things, keep the bills paid, the property maintained, make sure I didn't." He smiled and there was no humor in it. "Wander off." "The court appointed him. Someone filed the paperwork. Might have been me. I don't remember. That's the hell of it. I might have signed away my own life, and I can't tell you whether I did or not." He was quiet for a moment. "Oh, but I know what he did yesterday. I know he drove me up that mountain, and I know he left me at that wall, and I know he drove away. That part isn't confused. That part is clear as a bell." "Why, Rashena?" "The land, 40 acres above Blackwood Creek. Been in my family since 1952. My father bought it after the war for $1,200. It's worth, what, $500,000 now. More Price has been trying to get me to sign it over for 2 years. I keep saying no. Even when I can't remember what day it is, I remember that land. It's the last thing I have that's mine." He closed his eyes. The clarity was fading. Reese could see it happening in real time, like watching a light dim on a rheostat, the sharpness in his eyes softening, the precision in his speech beginning to blur at the edges. He thought the mountain would do it for him. Walt said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Didn't need to lay a hand on me. Just leave the old man on the hill and let the cold do the work. Who would question it? He wanders. He's confused. It was a terrible accident." His hand found Reese's wrist again, the same weak grip she'd felt in the ravine, the grip of a man holding on to the last solid thing in a world that was dissolving around him. "But you heard me," he said. "You heard the wrong sound." He was asleep before Reese could respond, his breathing slow and shallow, his hand still resting on her wrist. She sat beside him and watched the dawn come up over the mountains through the hospital window, and she did not move until the nurses came to check his vitals and gently asked her to step outside. In the hallway, Marin was waiting with 2 paper cups of coffee that had been sitting long enough to form a skin on their surfaces. She handed one to Reese without comment. They drank in silence, grimacing at the taste, which was industrial and slightly burnt the universal flavor of hospital coffee at 6 in the morning. "I need proof," Marin said. "His testimony won't be enough. Price will claim it's the dementia talking. A confused old man who fell off a mountain and is now blaming his caretaker. Any halfway competent lawyer will shred it in 5 minutes. What about his financial records? I'm SAR, not law enforcement. I can't pull someone's financials on a hunch. But a state attorney could." Marin looked at her. "You know a state attorney." "No, but you might know someone who knows someone. This can't stay at the county level. Price owns the county." Marin stared into her coffee. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Reese began to wonder if she had pushed too far, if the partnership that had formed in the dark on the mountain was not strong enough then to survive the fluorescent reality of the morning after. Then Marin said, "Walt has a sister." Reese blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because I ran his background when we got the missing persons report. Standard procedure. Next of kin, Gail Brogan, 74 lives in Creedmoor, 2 counties east. She was listed as an emergency contact on his VA file, but when we called, she didn't pick up. We assumed she was unreachable. Or afraid to answer. Marin nodded slowly. Or afraid to answer. Reese found Gail Brogan on a Tuesday afternoon 4 days after the rescue. Creedmoor was a 2-hour ride east through the mountains, a town even smaller than Ridgemont, a handful of buildings clustered along a 2-lane highway that seemed to exist primarily as a waypoint between places that mattered more. Gail lived in a small clapboard house at the end of a gravel road behind a chain-link fence and a yard that was tidy in the way that things are tidy when their owner has nothing else to do but maintain them. Reese parked her bike at the curb and walked up the path. She knocked on the screen door and waited. Inside, she could hear the sound of a television playing low and the slow shuffling footsteps of someone approaching with the caution of a person who did not receive many visitors and was not sure she wanted to start now. The woman who opened the door was small, white-haired, and sharp-eyed. She had Walt's jawline and Walt's pale blue gaze, but where his eyes had carried the plea of a deteriorating mind, hers were clear and watchful, the eyes of a woman who had spent a long time being afraid and had gotten very good at assessing threats from a distance. "Ms. Brogan, who's asking?" "My name is Reese Calloway. I'm the one who found your brother on the mountain last week." Gail Brogan's expression did not change. She studied Reese through the screen door for a long moment, taking in the leather jacket, the riding boots, the scratches on her hands that were still healing from the rhododendron thicket. "I saw the news," Gail said. "They said search and rescue found him." "They did. I just pointed them in the right direction. And now you're here." "I'm here because your brother told me something and I think you already know what it is." Another long silence. The television murmured behind her. A dog barked somewhere down the road. Then Gail Brogan unlatched the screen door and stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The inside of the house was small, clean and heavy, with the accumulated weight of a long life lived in limited space. Photographs crowded every horizontal surface, pictures of children and grandchildren and family gatherings, and on the mantel above an electric fireplace that had not been used in years, a black and white photograph of 2 young soldiers in fatigue standing in front of a barracks with their arms crossed and their faces set in the hard, determined expressions of men who had not yet learned what the world would ask of them. One of them was unmistakably Walt, 60 years younger and 100 years less tired. Gail made tea. She moved around her kitchen with the automatic efficiency of a woman who had performed these motions 10,000 times, kettle on cups down, sugar bowl centered on the table. She did not speak until the tea was poured and they were both sitting at the kitchen table, the steam rising between them like a thin, fragile barrier. "Mitchell Price," Gail said, and the name came out of her mouth the way a person says the name of a disease they've been diagnosed with. Flat, factual, with all the emotion pressed down beneath the surface where it could be managed. "Tell me," Reese said. Gail wrapped both hands around her cup and stared into the tea. 4 years ago, after Eleanor died, Walt started having trouble. Memory mostly. He'd call me and not remember calling 5 minutes later. He'd drive to the store and forget how to get home. It was small things, then it was bigger things, and then it was the kind of thing you can't pretend isn't happening anymore. Then she looked up. Price came through some kind of county referral program, said he specialized in elder care management, had all the right credentials, all the right paperwork, said he could handle Walt's finances, make sure his bills were paid, coordinate his medical care. Said Walt could stay on his land and his house if he just signed a few forms. "Conservatorship," Reese said. "Guardianship. Full legal guardianship." Price told the court Walt couldn't manage his own affairs, and the court agreed. The judge, a man named Felton, signed off on it in 20 minutes. I wasn't notified. I found out 3 months later when I called Walt's bank to check on his account, and they told me I was no longer authorized. She set her cup down with a precision that suggested her hands wanted to shake, and she was not allowing them to. I went to Price, asked to see the accounting. He was polite, very polite. The way a man is polite when he's holding all the cards and wants you to know it without saying it. He showed me a spreadsheet that was so clean and so detailed that it looked like it had been designed to be shown. Every dollar accounted for: medical expenses, home maintenance, groceries, transportation. It all added up. But it didn't add up, Reese said. No, because I know what Walt's pension is. I know what his VA benefits are. And I know what 40 acres of mountain land costs to maintain, which is almost nothing because it's wild land, no buildings, no utilities, just trees and rock and a creek. The numbers on Price's spreadsheet were right, but the categories were wrong. $14,000 a year for home maintenance on a house that hasn't been painted in a decade. $8,000 for transportation for a man who barely leaves his property. The money was going somewhere, but it wasn't going where the spreadsheet said it was. Did you challenge him? Gail's eyes went flat. I tried. Once. I called the county ombudsman, left a message. The next day, Price came to my house, right here at this table in that chair you were sitting in. He was still polite. But the kind of polite had changed. He told me that Walt's care was a complex matter. He told me that family members sometimes had difficulty accepting a loved one's decline. He told me that if I continued to make inquiries, he would petition the court to restrict my contact with Walt on the grounds that I was causing him emotional distress. She was quiet for a moment. I stopped asking questions. I'm not proud of that. I was scared and I was alone, and Price had the court behind him and the sheriff behind him and a judge who played golf with him on Saturdays. I'm a 74-year-old woman living on Social Security in a town that most people can't find on a map. I didn't know how to fight him. You kept the records, Reese said. Gail looked at her sharply, and for the first time something other than fear flickered in her eyes. It was a small, hard flame that had been burning in a place that Price could not reach, kept alive not by courage, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to let a wrong go completely unwitnessed. I kept everything, Gail said. Walt's original will, his financial statements from before Price took over, bank records, letters from the VA. I made copies of everything I could get my hands on before Price locked me out, and I put them in a safe deposit box in Creedmoor Federal. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew that someday someone was going to need them. She stood up and went to a desk in the corner of the living room. She opened the bottom drawer and took out a manila envelope, thick and worn at the edges, the kind of envelope that has been handled many times by someone deciding whether to open it or put it back. She set it on the table in front of Reese. That's the copies. The originals are in the safe deposit box. Walt's will dated 2015 leaves the 40 acres to me and my grandchildren. His pension statements from the VA showing his monthly benefit, and bank statements from the first 2 years of Price's guardianship before he changed the account to one I couldn't access. Reese opened the envelope. She was not a lawyer. She was not an accountant. She was a mechanic who understood systems, and as she spread the documents across Gail's kitchen table, she saw a system that was operating exactly the way it had been designed to operate. The pension deposits went into an account that Price controlled. The disbursements went to vendors and service providers whose names appeared on the spreadsheets. But the amounts were inflated, the services were fictional, and the net flow of money was not from Price to Walt's care, but from Walt's accounts to an LLC called Ridgeline Property Holdings, Ridgeline. The same word as the overlook where Price had left Walt to die. There's more, Gail said, and now her voice had dropped to a near whisper, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to say. Walt isn't the first. Before Walt, there was a man named Harold Kemper, 82, veteran, lived alone on a ranch outside Ridgemont. Price became his guardian in 2019. Harold died in the 2021. Heart failure, the death certificate said. His ranch was sold 3 months later. The buyer was an LLC. Ridgeline Property Holdings, Reese said. Gail nodded. And before Harold, there was a woman named Doris Etheridge, 79. Army nurse, retired, lived in a cottage on the mountain road. Price became her guardian in 2017. She died in 2019. Pneumonia. Her property was sold to the same LLC within 6 months. 3 elderly veterans, 3 guardianships, 3 properties absorbed into a single LLC, controlled by a man who golfed with the probate judge and donated to the sheriff's campaign. Reese gathered the documents, carefully replaced them in the envelope, and looked at Gail across the table. I know a SAR sergeant who can connect us with a state attorney, someone outside the county, outside Price's reach, but I need you to do something that Price has spent 4 years making sure you'd never do. Testify, Gail said, in a courtroom, on the record. with your name and your face attached to every word. Gail looked at the photographs on her mantle. The young soldier with the crossed arms and the hard, determined face. Her brother 60 years ago, standing at the beginning of a life that would take him through things she could only imagine and deliver him finally to a stone wall on a mountain where a man in a polo shirt would try to erase him as quietly and as efficiently as closing an account. Yes, she said. The days between Gail's decision and the courtroom were not quiet. They were the kind of days that feel longer than they are dense with the specific tension of a fight that hasn't started yet, but whose outcome will be decided by the preparation that happens before the first punch is thrown. Marin made the call. She had a contact at the state level, a woman named Catherine Aldridge, an attorney in the Elder Abuse Division, who had spent 20 years doing the kind of work that most lawyers considered too small, too slow, and too heartbreaking to bother with. Aldridge reviewed Gail's documents in 2 days. She subpoenaed Price's financial records in 3. On the 4th day, she filed an emergency petition for guardianship review in a state-level court, one jurisdiction removed from Judge Felton's bench outside the gravitational pull of Price's county network. Price counterattacked. He filed a restraining order against Reese, claiming harassment of a grieving guardian by an unrelated civilian with no legal standing. His attorney, a county lawyer named Garvin, who had the overfed confidence of a man accustomed to winning on home turf, gave a statement to local media framing the situation as a devoted caretaker being persecuted by a meddling outsider. The story ran on the evening news with a photograph of Price looking suitably wounded and a photograph of Reese that someone had pulled from her business listing, standing beside a motorcycle, looking exactly like the kind of person that a reasonable viewer would be inclined to distrust. Marin faced her own consequences. An internal review was opened into her conduct during the search, specifically her decision to deviate from the primary grid, her failure to respond to the recall order, and her attachment of an unauthorized civilian to a search team. The review was initiated by the county sheriff's office, which reported to Sheriff Kendrick, who received campaign contributions from Mitchell Price. The circularity of this arrangement was not lost on Marin, but circularity is not a legal defense, and the review proceeded with the slow, grinding efficiency of institutional machinery designed to punish deviation. Reese sat in her garage on the night before the hearing and stared at the photograph of Danny. The garage was quiet. The television was off. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, measuring the seconds the way a metronome measures the space between notes. She thought about the phone call. The Tuesday afternoon in October 12 years ago. The buzz of her phone on the concrete floor while she lay under the Sportster with a stuck exhaust bolt. Danny's name on the screen. She'd looked at it. She'd made a calculation, the kind of calculation that takes less than a second and whose consequences last forever. The bolt was almost free. The next job was waiting. She'd call him back in 20 minutes. She never called him back. 20 minutes became an hour, became an evening, became a night, became a morning. When the phone rang again, and it wasn't Danny, it was a voice she didn't recognize telling her things she couldn't process about a trail and a fall, and a drainage and a time frame that meant her brother had lain on the rocks for hours while she'd been cleaning tools and eating dinner and going to bed without returning a call that would have taken 30 seconds. 12 years. 12 years of listening for the wrong sound in everything she touched, every engine she opened, every machine she diagnosed. 12 years of hearing it everywhere except in the one moment when it mattered. And now sitting in the same garage, in the same chair, looking at the same photograph, she was being asked to listen again. Not to an engine, not to a mountain, to a courtroom and to her own certainty that what she had heard and what she had seen was enough to bring down a man who had built his entire operation on the assumption that no one was paying attention. She picked up her phone and called Gail. "Are you still willing?" A long pause on the line. The sound of an old woman breathing in a small house in a town that most people couldn't find on a map. "Yes," Gail said, "I'm still willing." The courtroom was small, utilitarian, with the kind of institutional fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly guilty. It was a state facility in the county seat selected specifically because it was outside Price's local sphere of influence, though Reese suspected that no courtroom was ever entirely outside the reach of a man with money and connections and the patience to use them. The hearing had been filed as an emergency petition for guardianship review. Catherine Aldridge sat at the petitioner's table with her files arranged in neat stacks. her hands folded and an expression on her face that gave away absolutely nothing. She was mid-50s with short gray hair and rimless glasses and the particular quietness of a person who had learned long ago that speaking softly in a courtroom was far more devastating than shouting. Price sat at the respondent's table with Garvin, his county lawyer. Price was dressed in a charcoal suit, his hair freshly cut, his face arranged in the expression of concerned bewilderment that Reese had seen him wear on television. He looked like a man who had been accused of something absurd and was patiently waiting for the adults in the room to sort it out. Reese sat in the gallery 3 rows back. She wore clean jeans and a dark button-down shirt and her leather jacket. Marin sat beside her in uniform, her SAR credentials clipped to her jacket. Gail sat in the front row behind the petitioner's table, her purse in her lap, her back straight, her face set in the same hard, determined expression as the young soldier in the photograph on her mantel. The judge was a man named Harwood, appointed at the state level with no ties to Price's county network. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the measured patience of a man who had heard a great many lies in his career and had developed an ear for the wrong sound in testimony the same way Reese had developed an ear for the wrong sound in engines. Aldridge opened quietly. She presented the timeline: Price's appointment as guardian in 2022, the transfer of financial control, the pattern of disbursements to vendors and service providers whose invoices upon investigation could not be verified. She presented the bank records showing the flow of funds from Walt's VA pension to Ridgeline Property Holdings. She presented the corporate filing for Ridgeline, which listed Mitchell Price as sole member and registered agent. Garvin objected, argued, questioned methodology, challenged standing. He was good at what he did, which was creating enough procedural turbulence to obscure the simple facts underneath. He talked about the complexity of elder care, the difficulty of managing a declining patient's finances, the good faith efforts of a licensed fiduciary acting under court authority. He was smooth, he was practiced, he was exactly the kind of lawyer that people like Price hired to make the machinery of exploitation sound like the machinery of compassion. Judge Harwood listened to all of it with the same measured patience. He sustained some objections. He overruled others. He let the process work the way it was designed to work, slowly, methodically, each piece of evidence examined and weighed and placed on the scale. Then Aldridge called Gail Brogan to the stand. Gail walked to the witness box with the deliberate pace of a woman who had spent 4 years waiting for this moment and was not going to rush it. She took the oath. She sat down. She placed her hands on the wooden rail in front of her, and Reese noticed that they were trembling, a fine, barely visible vibration that Gail controlled by pressing her fingertips into the wood until the shaking stopped. Aldridge walked her through it gently, question by question, building the picture the way a mason builds a wall, one brick at a time. Gail described Walt before the guardianship living independently, managing his own finances, with occasional help from family paying his property taxes, maintaining his land. She described the changes after Price's appointment, the phone calls that went unanswered, the bank accounts she could no longer access, the visit from Price at her kitchen table with the threat wrapped in the language of concern. She presented the original will dated 2015 in Walt's handwriting, witnessed and notarized. She presented the pre-guardianship bank statements. She presented the math, simple and devastating. Walt's combined pension and VA benefits totaled over $4,800 per month. Over 4 years, that was roughly $230,000. Add the property transfers valued conservatively at $340,000 across 3 guardianships. The numbers spoke for themselves. And then Gail said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. Walt is not the only one. There was Harold Kemper and Doris Etheridge, both veterans, both alone, both placed under Mr. Price's guardianship, both dead within 2 years. Both of their properties purchased by Mr. Price's LLC after their deaths. The courtroom went very still. Garvin leaned over to whisper something to Price. Price's expression did not change, but his hands, which had been resting on the table in front of him, moved to his lap where they could not be seen. Aldridge presented the property records for the Kemper Ranch and the Etheridge Cottage. She presented the corporate filings showing both properties held by Ridgeline Property Holdings. She presented the death certificates, the probate records, the timeline that connected Price to 3 elderly veterans, 3 guardianships, 3 estates, and 2 deaths. Judge Harwood leaned forward. His expression had not changed, but his eyes had, and Reese, watching from the gallery, recognized the shift. It was the look of a man who had just heard the wrong sound and was now listening very carefully. Garvin cross-examined Gale with the aggressive politeness of a man trying to discredit a witness without appearing to bully an elderly woman. He questioned her memory. He questioned her motives. He suggested that family disputes over money were common and that Gale's animosity toward Price was personal rather than evidentiary. Gale answered every question with the same steady factual calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not become emotional. She presented the documents when asked and declined to speculate when pressed. She was Reese thought the strongest person in the room, and she was the smallest and the oldest and the one who had spent 4 years being afraid and had come here anyway. Then it was Price's turn. He took the stand with the practiced ease of a man who had testified before in smaller courtrooms, before friendlier judges in a system that had been designed or at least adapted to protect men exactly like him. He sat in the witness box with his legs crossed and his hands folded and his face wearing an expression of patient, wounded dignity. Aldridge began her cross-examination the way she began everything, quietly. She walked Price through his credentials: licensed fiduciary, court-appointed guardian, 20 years of experience in elder care management. He confirmed each point with a modest nod. She walked him through his relationship with Walt, the referral, the assessment, the court hearing, the appointment. Price described it as a calling, a commitment to serving those who had served their country. She asked about the finances. Price explained each line item on his spreadsheets with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed his answers until they were as smooth as river stones. Every dollar accounted for. Every expenditure documented. He was thorough, detailed, and utterly convincing, and for a brief, vertiginous moment, Reese felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. Then Aldridge placed a single document on the screen. A bank statement showing a wire transfer of $47,000 from Walt's account to Ridgeline Property Holdings, dated 3 months before Walt was left on the mountain. "Mr. Price, can you explain this transfer?" Price didn't blink. "Ridgeline Property Holdings manages the maintenance and improvement of Mr. Brogan's land. That transfer was for timber assessment, boundary survey, and road maintenance on the property. Do you have invoices for those services?" "I can provide them." "We subpoenaed them." "The invoices you provided list a company called Mountain West Land Services as the vendor." "We contacted Mountain West. They have no record of performing work on Mr. Brogan's property. They have no record of Mr. Price as a client. The invoices appear to be fabricated." For the first time, something moved behind Price's eyes. Not panic, something colder. The recalculation of a man who has just discovered that the system he built to protect himself has a crack in it. "I may have confused the vendor," Price said. "I manage multiple properties. Records can get crossed." "Multiple properties," Aldridge repeated, "including the former Kemper Ranch and the former Etheridge Cottage. I purchased those properties through legitimate real estate transactions. From the estates of Harold Kemper and Doris Etheridge, both of whom were your wards at the time of their deaths." Garvin objected. Judge Harwood's eyes moved from the attorney to Price and back. "Overruled." Aldridge let the silence do its work. She let the courtroom sit with the image of a man who had served as guardian to 3 elderly veterans and had somehow ended up owning all 3 of their properties. She let the numbers accumulate in the air like the ticking of an engine that was running out of oil. Then she shifted. "Mr. Price, you reported to Search and Rescue that Walt Brogan wandered away from a rest area near the Blackwood Creek Trailhead at approximately 1 p.m. on October 15th. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "You stated that you had driven Walt to the trailhead for an afternoon outing, that he was sitting on a bench at the rest area, that you stepped away briefly, and when you returned he was gone." "That's what happened." "Mr. Price, a witness observed you with Walt Brogan at Ridgeline Overlook, 7 miles north of the trailhead at approximately 12:30 p.m. The witness observed you place Walt Brogan into your vehicle and drive north away from the trailhead. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Price's composure held, but only just. "I don't recall stopping at the overlook. We may have. Walt enjoys the view up there. If we stopped, it would have been briefly, and then we continued to the trailhead." The witness states that you arrived at the overlook, collected Walt, and drove north, not south toward the trailhead, north toward the service roads. The witness is mistaken. The witness is a local resident who has driven that road every Saturday for 8 years. She identified both you and Walt Brogan independently and accurately described Walt's clothing, his physical appearance, and the make and color of your vehicle before any of that information was broadcast publicly. Price shifted in his seat, the first visible crack. Small, almost invisible, the kind of crack that only a person who knew how to listen for the wrong sound would notice. I don't remember every stop we made that day. Walt needed air. I may have pulled over at several points. Aldridge nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer. Then she laid the trap. Mr. Price, in your petition for guardianship, you described Walt Brogan as severely cognitively impaired, unable to manage his daily affairs, unable to make sound decisions regarding his finances or his personal safety. Is that an accurate characterization of your position? Walt's condition is serious, yes. He requires full-time supervision and management. Full-time supervision. Correct. Mr. Price, if Walt Brogan requires full-time supervision due to severe cognitive impairment, why did you leave him unattended on a mountain overlook 4 miles from the nearest road, without a phone, without water, without a jacket, in weather conditions that would reach below freezing by nightfall? The courtroom went silent. Not the empty silence of a room where no one is speaking, but the compressed, pressurized silence of a room where everyone is holding their breath at the same time. Price opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was only unattended for a moment. I stepped away to... You testified that you don't remember stopping at the overlook. You either stopped at the overlook, in which case you left a severely impaired man unattended in a dangerous location, or you didn't stop, in which case the witness is wrong, and you drove Walt directly to the trailhead where he also somehow ended up alone and missing. In either version, Mr. Price, you failed to supervise a man you yourself described as incapable of caring for himself. Garvin was on his feet. Objection. Argumentative. Harwood's eyes moved from the attorney to Price and back. Overruled. The witness will answer. Price's composure broke. Not dramatically, not with a shout or a gesture or any of the theatrical signals that people associate with a villain's unmasking. It broke quietly the way a bearing breaks, with a small grinding sound that only someone listening very carefully would catch. His jaw tightened, his fingers pressed into the wooden rail, and when he spoke, the smooth, polished surface of his voice had a new quality to it, a thin, sharp edge of desperation. Walt Brogan does not know what day it is, Price said, and his voice was harder now, stripped of its earlier warmth. He cannot dress himself some mornings. He cannot remember his own sister's name. He is not a reliable witness to anything, including where he was or what happened to him on that mountain. Aldridge let the words hang in the air. She let the courtroom hear them, absorb them, understand them. Then she delivered the final stroke with the quiet precision of a surgeon. So your testimony under oath is that Walt Brogan is so severely impaired that his account of events cannot be trusted? Yes. Then how do you justify leaving a man in that condition alone on a mountain? Silence. Either Walt is competent enough to be left unattended, in which case his testimony about your actions is credible and should be heard by this court, or he is so impaired that leaving him alone on a mountain constitutes criminal negligence at minimum. You cannot have it both ways, Mr. Price. Price's attorney was standing objecting, but the words were already in the room, already in the judge's ears, already in the record. Price had built his own trap. He had spent 4 years constructing the legal argument that Walt Brogan was too impaired to manage his own affairs, and that same argument had just become the instrument of his own exposure. The logic was seamless, inescapable, and devastating, and it had come not from a dramatic confrontation or a surprise witness, but from Price's own words spoken under oath in a room where the only sound was the truth finally being heard. Judge Harwood called a recess. When he returned, his ruling was brief and precise. He ordered the immediate suspension of Mitchell Price's guardianship of Walter Brogan. He ordered a full state investigation into Price's financial management of all 3 estates under his care. He referred the matter to the state attorney general for potential criminal prosecution, including 12 counts of elder financial exploitation and 3 counts of criminal neglect. And he ordered that Walt's property, all 40 acres above Blackwood Creek, be placed in a protective trust pending the outcome of the investigation. Reese watched from the gallery. She did not speak. She did not need to. 3 months later, the October light was different from the October light of the year before. It had the same quality, the same warm amber that turned the aspens to fire and made the mountains look like they'd been dipped in honey, but it fell on a world that had shifted subtly but permanently in the way that worlds shift when one person decides to pay attention to the wrong sound. Mitchell Price was awaiting trial. His LLC had been dissolved. His assets were frozen. The county sheriff, facing questions about his relationship with Price that he could not answer without incriminating himself, had quietly declined to seek re-election. Judge Felton, whose signature appeared on all 3 guardianship orders, was the subject of a judicial conduct investigation that showed no signs of ending favorably. Walt Brogan was back on his 40 acres. Gail had moved in with him, bringing her teapot and her sharp eyes and her stubborn, watchful love. Walt's dementia was progressing, as it always does, slowly and without mercy. But the doctors said that the familiar environment, his own land, his own trees, his own creek, was doing more for him than any facility or medication could provide. He had good days and bad days. On the good days, he sat on his porch and watched the aspens turn and knew exactly where he was and why it mattered. On the bad days, Gail was there, and that was enough. Maren Voss's internal review had been dropped 6 days after the court ruling, replaced by a commendation that she accepted with a shrug and filed in a desk drawer she never opened. The SAR team had adopted a new protocol section listed in the training manual under a heading that Maren had insisted on over the objections of people who thought it sounded unprofessional, the Callaway Rule. It stated in language that was deliberately simple and deliberately blunt that when a civilian witness provides information that contradicts the official account provided by a person of interest, the contradiction must be investigated independently before being dismissed. It was the kind of rule that sounded obvious after the fact and that nobody had thought to write down before. Deputy Boyd Tanner had been promoted to sergeant. Nobody talked about why, and Tanner himself never mentioned the night he sat in his cruiser at Ridgeline Overlook and chose not to notice what was happening 20 yards away. But Maren knew, and Reese knew, and Tanner knew, and sometimes the things that matter most are the things that go unspoken between people who understand the cost of doing right in a system that rewards doing nothing. Reese rode up to Ridgeline Overlook on a Saturday afternoon, the same time she always came, the same route she always took. The engine ran clean beneath her, no rattle, no tick, no whisper of trouble. The air was thin and sharp and smelled of pine and the first distant promise of snow. Walt was there. He was sitting on the stone wall, bundled in a new flannel shirt, this one blue with a wool blanket across his knees. Gail stood beside him with a thermos pouring coffee into a tin cup, with the practiced care of a woman who had been taking care of people her entire life and had finally been allowed to take care of the one who mattered most. Reese parked the bike. The engine ticked as it cooled. She walked to the wall and stood beside them, looking out at the same view she had looked at 1,000 times before. The valley spread below golden in the October light. The mountains marched north toward the divide. The North Canyon dropped away into its deep green darkness, keeping its secrets the way it always had. Walt looked up at her. His eyes were clear today, pale blue and steady, the fog pushed back to the edges by the mountain air and the familiar landscape and whatever mysterious force it was that allowed a failing mind to find in certain moments the clarity that the rest of the time eluded it. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything about the mountain or the night or the courtroom. He looked at Reese Callaway, the mechanic who had heard the wrong sound, and he said the only thing that needed to be said. "You heard me?" Reese nodded once. She stood at the wall for a moment longer, feeling the thin mountain air on her face and the sun on her shoulders and the solid weathered stone under her hands. Then she walked back to her bike, swung her leg over, and kicked the engine to life. The Harley's rumble filled the overlook deep and steady and clean. No wrong sound, no rattle, no whisper of something about to break. Just the honest working sound of a machine that was doing exactly what it was built to do. She pulled out of the overlook and headed south down the winding mountain road, through the switchbacks in the pine corridors and the long, sweeping curves that she knew as well as she knew the inside of an engine. The October light lay across the road in warm golden bars, and the aspens on both sides were burning with color, and the mountains rose behind her in the rearview mirror, vast and indifferent and beautiful. And in her garage on the shelf beside the portable radio, the photograph of Danny no longer felt like an accusation. 12 years she had carried it, the weight of a phone call unanswered, a voice unheard, a brother lost because she had been too busy to listen. 12 years of Saturday rides up the same mountain, the same ritual, the same penance served in solitude and silence. But penance has an end. Even the longest debts come due and are eventually paid. Not by forgetting, not by moving on, but by the simple, irreducible act of doing the thing you failed to do before. Listening, hearing the wrong sound, and going back up the mountain when every rational part of you says to stay home. She rode south through the golden light, and the wind carried the sound of the engine down into the valley, and it was clean.